Hey, good morning, everybody. I know, you missed us yesterday. The world just didn't quite seem the same without a daily blast of rationality and reason, or whatever it is that you think Mike and I contribute to your world. You know, the fact of the matter is, Mike had a busy weekend, house full, celebrating Liam's ex-birthday. I don't want to give the age out because that's too much personal information. I had a friend come up and I had to be I'm up in Vermont right now. I had to be sociable and accommodating. And so, Mike and I talked to each other yesterday and we thought, oh my God, a couple of grumpy, well, in my case, grumpy old men. In Mike's case, a grumpy young man. But in either case, we're sorry to have let you down. We're back. I had an opportunity yesterday to look at Tucker's interview with Vladimir Putin. And we only touched upon it last week. I thought it was extremely interesting, Mike. I'm going to look at parts of it again. I know that Tim Snyder has a piece on it, where he accuses Putin of cherry picking history and creating a false image of the past. But let's focus first on Putin and Tucker, and then maybe fold in a few of Snyder's observations and some observations of our. As you know, Tucker Carlson was in Moscow recently, and I believe on February 6th, he interviewed Vladimir Putin in a no-holds-bars, time unlimited context. And that interview was broadcast on X at 6 o'clock on Thursday evening. I've read some accounts of the interview. I would recommend that each of you look at the interview yourself. The accounts don't do it justice. So, for example, one account is that Putin, kind of filibustered or bored his way through the first half an hour and reciting history that didn't really mean anything. I disagree, and I think that the first part of the interview was extremely revealing. Tucker starts asking questions about the Ukraine. Putin then pivots to a discussion of Russian history, reaching back into the 9th century when Russia or the Rus was created, and talks about the territorial ambitions and the sense of unity that developed around Russia and the creation of a Russian entity, of a Russian people, of a Russian empire, and the ambitions of that empire rolling forward into the centuries. Tucker sat silently, which is a rare thing for him to do, looking almost like a schoolboy agog in the presence of the master. And when he tried to break in from time to time, Vladimir would look at him and, say, I thought you wanted to have a discussion. Or so the translator would say. Vladimir doesn't speak English. Tucker doesn't speak Russian. And then he would, just without missing a beat, pick up where he left off. And so I had the impression that Putin was very, very well prepared for this interview, that he was the grand master of chess, and that Tucker was trying to figure out the difference between chess and checkers. And it didn't reflect well on Tucker. It didn't reflect poorly on him. But here's where I thought it was interesting, and where all of that history that Putin unpacked shed light on the current conflict in the Ukraine. Putin went on to say that, the Russian people have a common history. They have a common language. 90% of Ukrainians or people in the Ukraine speak Russian. They have a common sense of faith. They have a common set of values. They have an identity that they're seeking to protect and preserve. And that identity, the Russian identity that they're seeking to protect and preserve, is one that often places them at conflict with the West. And the West, in our current time, is the focal point of it for Russia is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was formed after the Second World War to provide collective security against the Soviet Union and against the East. But when the Soviet Union declined or disintegrated, and Russia, the Russian people, were left with territorial and national aspirations of their own, Putin actually approached Western leaders and said, can we join NATO? Can we have a collective security agreement with Europe, the Atlantic, and the Russian people against the threat of Iran? And he was rebuffed. NATO said no. When NATO was formed and when the Soviet Union declined, there were multilateral talks among the parties, and it was promised that NATO would not expand eastward. But yet here it is doing so. And from Putin's perspective, there is an identity that he seeks to preserve as against what he calls the West. And last week we talked about pan-Slavism versus Westernizing influences as a theme in Russian history and as a means of explaining and Putin's antagonism toward the West. Putin didn't come across as hostile to the West, but he came across as wary of it. And he came across as having a set of values independent of the values that the West seems to want to expand upon or push in NATO, and that it seeks to that it's seeking to mobilize in support of the Ukraine. From Putin's perspective, there never was a Ukrainian nation. There were territorial and imperial power grabs between Poland and Russia. And at various points, Poland had one side of the Dnieper River, Russia had the other. And it was only in recent times that an independent Ukraine was fostered. And Putin might ask, well, who's fostering it? Who benefits? Who gains by that? Well, the West does. And the West does at the expense of Russia's pan-Slavic identity.
Well, and he also talks about the Bolsheviks' role in the creation of what we would call the Ukraine, right? The outer lands, the fringe of what is Mother Russia, right? It is, you know, the previous fathers of the Russian entity that were, right, Lenin, Stalin, and the role that those two respectively had in fostering the Bolsheviks in the USSR. Right, these outposts of Russian sovereignty that actually weren't anything.
Yeah, and he seemed a little disingenuous, Putin did, when he said, you know, Lenin did these things, and I don't understand. I don't know why he did that. You know, I mean, I'm no student of Russian history, but I have a sense that there was a lot more going on than Putin let on. But what I want to listen to the back end of it again, because in a struggle between pan-Slavism and the West, my impression is pan-Slavism wins, and Putin knows why, and he's confident. And it doesn't win because it has more material resources. It doesn't win because it has greater access to ports. It doesn't win because it has a larger alliance and more numbers to throw in a battle. But it wins an ideological contest because you had the sense, talking to Putin, that he knew who he was and where he was going. And you had the sense, looking at Tucker, that he was confused and groping. And you have the sense, looking at the West, that our commitment to pluralism, detached from its underlying commitment to the values in which pluralism has grown, has led to a sort of pointless sense of activity in the West. We seek to expand for expansion's sake. The neoliberal political order was designed to foster market economies, but it fosters market economies at the expense of any identity. In other words, your only identity can be that of a consumer, and there's no real evaluation of what things are worth consuming and not.
On that point, Norm, I don't know if you caught the implication that Putin made pretty clearly, right? The consequence of a statement that he made that accused America of being the people of America as being unmoored from any loyalty to the territory that is the United States of America, by comparing it to that of the diversity of spiritual and religious affiliations within Russia, and the fact that no matter how divergent those spiritual and or religious affiliations were among its people, that everybody had in common that they were Russian, that the homeland, that Russia is the homeland. And he made a very stark contrast in this interview to Tucker about the current state of America, in that most of the people here who would I guess look much the same in terms of religious and or spiritual affiliation and their core beliefs, and how divergent those might be on balance, that America's existential problem is that it does not have a binding or unifying force right now.
Well, that may be. And I mean, you get the sense talking, you know, I had a sense of like nostalgic envy almost, you know, of Putin and the Russian people having a long historic connection to a region, having weathered many storms, you know, the Soviet Revolution, world wars and whatnot. And they keep coming back to a center that provides them with a place to stand and from which to view the rest of the world. I get the impression in the United States that we're without a center now, that we've turned on ourselves, that we've turned on our own history. And rather than seeking to use it as a stream to nourish us into the future, we're using it now as an ideological weapon, each to advance our own idiosyncratic sense of selves. So it was
before we move on, because we are promising a closer examination here, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but there's the obvious language barrier, or I put obvious in quotation marks, because we know that Putin is former KGB, and he makes a nod to Tucker as having been at one point nearly within the ranks of the CIA or the United States security apparatus as well. And he makes a statement, thank God they didn't let you in, sort of thing. My question, Norm, is Putin obviously speaks English, no?
I don't know that. I don't know enough about the man.
Well, but that part of the interview is really interesting to me, just from a framing perspective, because there's a delay. There is, a transcriptionist. There is a translator involved. But these are two men of some of the highest education available to man, right? And what strikes me is that most people in Europe, most learned people in Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, speak multiple languages, 3 or 4 languages. It's very common. And it seems unlikely to me that Putin has reigned in Russia for 20 plus years now, that without picking up English, not just in sort of conversational English, but as a matter of geopolitical and diplomatic necessity.
Well, I'm sure that he can stumble through it, but on the other hand, if you want to speak from the heart, speak your native tongue, and if you want to get it right and get the nuances, have a translator.
What's lost within this interview based on that translation? I do wonder that, right? Because we're getting some comments. Junior is talking about Putin being intellectually a few levels above Tucker. I don't know that that's obvious, right? It says pretty obvious. I don't know that that's obvious to me at all. I think quite a lot of Tucker, but I don't know that there's I don't know that the role of the interviewer is to be seen and to impress from an intellectual perspective. And to that end, if he's able to give Putin a platform to express what he's doing and one is impressed by that, then he's done his job. But I also think that there's some high-level gamesmanship being played within this interview. I find that part fascinating. And Norm, there is a follow-up interview, not with the interviewee, meaning that Tucker is the subject, at the World Government Summit. And so this is just a few hours old here. You can see here on the screen. I'll send this to you. It's about 27 minutes long. And Tucker is actually interviewed on stage at the World Government Summit following his interview with Vladimir Putin. And I'm almost all the way through it. Pretty interesting stuff. So
interesting choice for Tucker, a supporter of populism, to appear at the World Government Summit. But I'll be happy to look at it. I don't.
Would be part of the American media blackout of this event, right? So again, he's got a lot to talk about following that. Is he going to get a fair shake here, stateside?
Well, let's see what happens. I mean, I think Vladimir ate Tucker's lunch. I'm not sure what he served up to us. I'm really looking forward to reading through Timothy Snyder's piece on this. But I think the message I got from, it's always a question of seeing what you want to see. And in my case, perhaps more so than many people, that I'm guilty of that. But I think what I was looking to see is whether Tucker had a unifying vision of the relationship between man and the state, the individual and society, that would explain the persistence of Russia over time. And he did. And he basically said, look, we're defending that against the West. And what he didn't say is a West that offers nothing but chaos and chaos and a dollar in a marketplace that can't sustain. Very interesting interview. Take a look at it, folks. I also spent some time this weekend reading through Her's report on Joe Biden and the decision not to prosecute Biden. Mike, and I thought about you because I think you're going to disagree with this. To my mind, if the report illustrates anything, it illustrates that we classify too many documents. I mean, basically.
I don't agree with that. Look, I'll go on record and say that I think that nobody else except for us has read more than a page of this document. To be honest with you, all of the pundits and talking heads are, saying that this document conclusively establishes that President Biden is da-da-da-da-da. It's like it was 388 pages, and none of you have done any of the actual reading. Do the homework.
Well, here's what the report establishes.
You know what it says.
Biden as Obama's vice president passionately disagreed with the buildup of troops in Afghanistan, and he thought it was a mistake and that history would prove him right. And Biden had a tendency of appearing at various meetings with note cards that he'd take notes on, would remind him of his agenda. Even then, I suppose he needed reminding. He kept notebooks of information when he attended meetings, both classified and not. When he left the administration, in other words, when the administration ended in January of 2017, Biden kept many of his notes, or kept some of his notes. And there's a lively dispute within administrations about what belongs to the individual and what belongs to the government. After the problem with the Nixon eras and the Nixon era and the retention of documents in 1978, Congress passed a law regarding presidential documents, and the claim was that these are documents that belong to the United States. They are not the personal property of a president or vice president. So Biden had documents of this sort, which he used in 2009 and again later in 2015 with a ghostwriter to produce memoirs. Those memoirs were in part an account of his role in history, and in part, campaign events or devices that he would use to tell his story to future generations of voters. In the course of preparing these memoirs, obviously he wanted to make a case and a point that he was right about Afghanistan and Obama was wrong. And to that end, in both a transitional home that he rented in Virginia and in his garage in Maryland, investigators found some documents that contained information relating to a famous 2009 memo, handwritten memo that he wrote to President Biden over Thanksgiving break, summarizing his heartfelt conclusions that this was a mistake. Now, in the course of evaluating
Obama or President Biden? President Obama?
I said Obama. Sorry about that. But that Biden kept material of the and a copy of the memo he wrote to Obama in 2009, talking about what a mistake it would be to build up in Afghanistan. A lot of the information in the 2009 memo has already appeared in a Bob Woodward book called Obama's Wars, which I think was published in 2010. So as I'm reading through the report, I'm thinking, what's the big deal? Apparently, special counsel Hur had the materials seized from Biden, distributed to various intelligence agencies so they could determine whether the release of this material still posed a threat to American national security. And not surprisingly, some of these agencies said it did. And I began to think, who owns history? Bob Woodward had access to a lot of this material, published it. Biden was a participant. He took notes of things about conversations and events that are now 15 years old. And he wants to tell the American people about his role in shaping historic events that cost many of us sons, daughters, brothers, and relatives. What in conflict in Afghanistan? What is the harm in letting the American people know about policy debates that took place at that time? Now, the intelligence community pushes back and will say, well, this will reflect sources and methods. It will reflect private conversations, and that's the harm. And I noticed, perhaps it was an odd weekend looking at Putin and then reading the Hur report. I noticed that Putin kept pulling punches in his interview with Carlson, saying, I don't want to talk about the specifics of the details. That is not what is done. This was confidential. Okay, is there honor among thieves? I suppose there is. Are there confidentiality agreements among diplomats? I suppose there is. But nobody owns history. And so we've created this national security apparatus with a very complex method of classifying documents and an entire bureaucratic industry and infrastructure regarding managing them, and criminal statutes that say when you violate these retention statutes and ordinances, you are potentially guilty of a crime. Did Biden retain records that he shouldn't have? Yes. Did he do so willfully? Hur pulls a punch. Maybe he's just a forgetful old man, the jury would say. I don't think so. I think he kept them because he wanted history. He wanted to show history he was on the right side, and he was going to demonstrate that in what he wrote. Having said that, I don't think that should be a crime. I think that, we obviously have a shared past and we want to know about it. And we don't want our past managed by a security apparatus. Again, a weird parallel to the Tucker Carlson Putin interview. On 2 occasions, Putin complains he's gone to the West seeking a better relationship. And when he spoke
Bill
both to
Clinton,
Bush,
one of those names, right?
Sr. and Bill Clinton, both said they'd look into it, and both got back to him and said, no, they'd spoken to their people and their people vetoed it. Who are those people? The head of intelligence agencies, the so-called deep state? And do they own our past? Do they want to keep from us truths that if we knew them, we would roust them from office? Maybe. So, I'm not a fan of Joe Biden, but I am a fan of understanding the world in which we live. And it's not at all clear to me that Biden's conduct rises to the level of prosecutable crimes. Sorry, it took me a minute to find the right word.
Well, and that's the conclusion that Hur came to as well. And principally, it was a legal standard, right? That what he found and upon analysis and review did not rise to the level of the culpable threshold for prosecuting. That was the standard at best. And I want to make sure that we frame this correctly. How much of Biden's mental state, his competence or lack thereof, was within this report, Norm? Like, how much focus on that?
First, remind me to get to that in 1 minute. I want to round out one other point. Those of you who say, well, but wait a minute, isn't Trump being prosecuted for retention of records? There is a material difference. One of the statutes that Biden could have been charged with was failure to return documents. And there is a claim that Trump's office materially took steps to not only refuse to return documents, but to hide and to dissemble. Biden was apparently forthcoming and forgetful. And so Herb says, what we're going to have if we take this to trial is an 80-year-old, an octogenarian president who's going to appear to be a likable, forgetful old man, and who a jury may conclude and decide was not culpable and decide not to convict. So I think Biden's cognitive status was a factor in Hur's report and in Hur's conclusion. I'm not sure that we want to grant octogenarians exemption from the law, but I think he had to ask the hard question: do I have a case that I can prove beyond a reasonable doubt? And he concluded there were reasons to doubt that Biden had willfully engaged in a violation of the statute. I would recommend, those of you who listen to this podcast and are intrigued by legal stuff, download that report, because it is, the first 150 pages or so can be a little tedious. It just goes on and on and on about these notes and note cards and what they were used for, where they came from, how they ended up in Biden's home. But then when the analysis shifts to the various federal offenses he may have committed, and how it is that a prosecutor evaluates whether to present a case, it's a truly fascinating stuff.
Yeah, T-Girl asks, why did Hur feel the need to write a 388-page report? Odd. Clinton was POTUS. Biden took the documents while senator. Also as vice president as well, as Norm is pointing out. I threw the link to the report in both the Rumble and YouTube chats. So if you would like to take a look at those and come to your own conclusion, you most certainly can. I think my bright line takeaway, Norm, is just that the issue of Biden's competence and his mental firmness is not one that's really up for debate at this point, but that most of the pundits and the political talking heads on the conservative and populist right are taking this report and making it into something that it is categorically not.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And that's my issue with this, is that if we're going to go at the issue of his competence, 25th Amendment stuff, this is not what people are branding it to be. So stop being led astray by that.
That's right. And T-Girl, why did Hur write a report? I believe that it is customary, if not required either by statute or regulation, for a special counsel to reduce to writing a decision not to prosecute, a declination to prosecute, and to give that report to the Attorney General. The more interesting question is, why was this one made public? I don't believe that they are necessarily public documents, but I think this one had to be made public in the context of our times, meaning we've got former President Trump currently being prosecuted for keeping documents at Mar-a-Lago, and people drawing an equivalence between what Trump did and what Biden was suspected of doing. And the fact of the matter is, they're entirely different. They resemble in kind the fact that both had, but what they did with them once they were accused of having them, how they responded, and frankly, what those documents were, are quite different. With respect to Biden, they appear to be old documents. I mean, for example, fault is found with the fact that he kept notes from trips overseas in the 1980s. I mean, seriously, that's 30 years ago. How are our participants in history supposed to write memoirs that give us that shed light, at least for the rest of us, on how our lives are managed if they can't have access to their own documents? I think the federal legislation declaring that the notes and personal effects of presidents and vice presidents while in office become the property of the United States is probably a mistake.
Well, and I think a lot of people's perspective on this is being clouded by this sort of incessant and unyielding desire for there to be parity in the way that Trump and Biden are being treated with respect to classified documents cases. So I think I can understand that at the surface level. But again, these two cases are distinct. Norm just gave you a legal reason that they are distinct. And also, stop reading so much into the Hur report. It's
read the report. Yeah.
Limited in its scope, so stop reading too much into it. There is no naivety in Norm's analysis just because it doesn't talk about the perspective that perhaps Biden sold stuff to foreign adversaries. What within the scope of this talked about Biden giving stuff to foreign adversaries? That wasn't the scope of the investigation.
No, that's right. So let's focus while we're on the topic of investigating.
Focus up.
Let's focus on the Fani Willis thing for tomorrow. So Fani's going to have to take the stand on the day after Valentine's Day. There would have truly been an irony if her hearing on potential disqualification in her prosecution of Donald Trump took place on Valentine's Day. But I guess the court had other ideas. Willis is on the hot spot. Why? She's prosecuting Donald Trump for state level RICO, racketeering influence, corrupt organization behavior with respect to his efforts to overturn the Georgia electoral vote. He and a handful of other associates face charges. One of his colleagues wrote a motion to disqualify Willis, claiming that she had a romantic relationship with Nathan, I think Wade, the top prosecutor she appointed to handle this case. Wade was a civil litigator without civil experience, or without substantial criminal experience, apparently had never defended a felony case before. And suddenly he is the recipient of unlimited funds from Georgia, as much as $650,000, approaching $1 million as we speak, for his role in investigating Donald. What's wrong with that, you say? Well, maybe not much. I mean, you know, as top prosecutor, she can name any old incompetent to handle whatever she likes. But if she's embedded with the man, and I mean that literally, like heating the sheets, taking cruises, enjoying the largesse that comes of the money that she has directed in his way, there might be a problem there. And so Wade is getting a divorce. Claims about his relationship with Wade, evidence of his providing financial benefits to Fani Willis have surfaced in the divorce trial. And now the judge presiding over the RICO case is going to hold a hearing on whether Fani should be disqualified because of an appearance of impropriety, or perhaps actual impropriety, in her handling of Georgia versus Donald Trump et al. Her office is resisting subpoenas. She had resisted a subpoena. She moved to quash a subpoena requiring her testimony. The judge denied that motion to quash. Jim Johnson, in one of the House Oversight Committees, has also issued a subpoena for Willis to appear and discuss how she's using federal funds. It seems to me unlikely that Fani's going to survive the week. It seems more likely that a new prosecution team will be put in place. I don't think that the state court judge is going to move to disqualify her this week, but the stink factor is becoming unavoidable. And suddenly Donald Trump is surviving in ways that I didn't think possible 3-4 months ago. This prosecution appears to be going off the rails for venal reasons. Fani didn't really need to appoint a lover to her, to her prosecution team. She didn't really need to accept gifts from him. What's that?
Didn't need to pay him $700,000 either, or go on a trip to Belize, or go
No.
to a parlor with him.
And then, to claim, as she did at an African Methodist Episcopal church, that she was only being picked on because she was black, that this was racism, and to make a nod in the direction of Martin Luther King's indiscretions and say, wink, wink, women can't get enough too. I mean, Fani, take a chill pill, babe. Yeah, I think you're on the ropes and you have only yourself to hang for this hanging, and don't you dare call it a lynching.
Yeah, that's right. And again, just so that we're on top of the legal standard here, officers of the court, of which Fani is most clearly an officer of the court, requires that they avoid even the appearance of impropriety or a conflict of interest. So it's not even necessarily the case that that Trump or his co-defendants need to be able to categorically prove that there is impropriety or a conflict of interest. It's necessarily that they're shooting their shot at this basket that is the appearance. And so far, like you said, Norm, I think that this is pretty much an inextricable label at this point.
Yeah, it is. And, Maury, I love the alliteration. Fulton Fanny's folly. Yeah. I'd say, fat Fani gets flattened. It more corresponds to my taste, but then I'm plebeian in character. So stay tuned for that. It'll be an eventful week. Trump's papers are filed in the United States Supreme Court asking for delay of the Jack Smith prosecution of him relating to January 6th, pending in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court could act quickly on this request to continue or at least keep in place the stay as to the underlying trial. Smith will push for a trial, but he's hard pressed to get his way. It was he, after all, that said the immunity issue needed to be resolved conclusively for the case to be tried. So when he starts screaming that the public interest requires a trial, we'll know that he's basically pimping for the Justice Department, and that what the bumper sticker on his car should say is anything but Trump. The fact of the matter is, this is lawfare. I'm not suggesting that Trump is above the law. I think the immunity questions presented by the case are profound and need resolving, and they may well cut against Trump for good reason. But the fact of the matter is, the case should be litigated deliberately and not with the hyper partisan flames of, or fanned flames of hysteria that seem to be propelling these cases against Donald Trump to where? Nowhere fast.
We have our newsletter coming out today. Norm will be publishing issue number 5. So if you have not yet subscribed, make sure you're subscribed to get that one today. We are a day behind. And beyond that, Norm, we are live every day, 8 a.m., Monday through Friday on X, YouTube, and Rumble at LawPod Daily. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Overcast, wherever you find premium podcasts. You'll be up in the Great White North for quite a while, yeah?
Yeah, we've got a lull in the schedule in the office. No trials until March, and so I'm up in Vermont for a couple weeks. Not a lot of snow up here. It's Greta Thunberg's getting her way. I want to create a bumper sticker up here. Everybody's complaining that the snowmobile season is really screwed up this year. So my response is blame Greta, and that's the bumper sticker that we'll be selling. But I'll be here broadcasting with Mike from the great gray north. There's probably 6-8 inches of snow on the ground, but you can see patches of field from time to time. But the temperature's falling this week. It'll be below zero soon, and I'll feel right at home.
Love that. AMF, yo-yo. AMF, everybody.
Ciao. See you tomorrow.
Bye.